Okay. Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining another episode of The Commons in Conversation, a series about the ways in which nonprofits and philanthropy are working to close the divisions that persist across the country, divisions that can include politics, race, gender, geography, class, income, all types of things. My name is Nandita Raghuram. I'm the Deputy Opinion Editor at the Chronicle of Philanthropy. And today I'm talking to Hali Lee, founder of the Asian Women Giving Circle and co-founder of the Donors of Color Network. Hali's new book is called The Big We: How Giving Circles Unlock Generosity, Strengthen Community, and Make Change. In it, she talks about how there are a lot of things that divide us, but one of them, a big one, is called Big Philanthropy, or what she calls Big Phil in the book. Big Phil is exemplified by large foundations, huge checks, billionaire donors, and she says that this divides the country rather than unites us. She posits, though, that the charitable giving of everyday folks, which can include mutual aid, volunteering, giving circles, all of these things can help people feel more connected to their communities, to one another, make them feel like their actions can actually make a difference, and overall just bring the country together. Hali, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to be here with you. Can you start by briefly explaining the ways in which Big Philanthropy focuses on the individual and why that's a problem?
First of all, thanks for having me on, Nandita. It's so nice to be here with the Commons and the Chronicle of Philanthropy. It's really an honor. So I wrote The Big We, and the first third of the book is a critique of what I call Big Phil, which is big, strategic, billionaire, knows best, KPIs, logic models, strategic philanthropy. And I think what Big Phil gets wrong is that, Anand Giridharadas and Rob Reich wrote beautiful, really good books in 2018 that critique Big Phil also. And the summary, my takeaway from those two books is that Big Phil doesn't have an incentive to change the systems that made him so rich to begin with. And I use the pronouns he, him to describe Big Phil, because usually it's a guy. Sometimes it's a dead guy who's running the show from the grave with a perpetually endowed foundation. To add to Anand's and Rob's argument that Big Phil isn't incentivized to change the systems that made him so rich to begin with. My addition to that argument is that relying on Big Phil inspires a sort of passivity in the rest of us. And our system doesn't work if we are passive. Our system works when we, the citizens of the United States, care enough to get educated and take action to address the things that we are concerned about. And I try to make the case that doing those things, caring and taking action, are easier to do and more fun to do and stickier over the long haul if we can do them in groups. And giving circles are a really good vehicle to do those, to get engaged civically in groups. So at the end of part one, I ask Big Phil to retire in peace. Thank you for your service. You've done a lot of good, but you've also done some harm, as I outline in the book. And structurally, I think it's a more sound play to collectivize ourselves and think collectively rather than relying on individualistic heroes to save us or our planet.
Yeah, and you discuss some of this in the book, but how is Big Phil why is it set up to focus on the individual? Like, how have we gotten to this point where there's such a focus on one billionaire who can fix all of our problems? And why is that system a problem?
Well, I think there's lots of reasons for that. I think we in this country have often had sort of a worship of the individual, the go out west, young man, found a country or a religion. That's been a theme. Think about some of our movies and popular culture where we've popularized and heroically idolize the individual, when in truth and in fact, it's almost always a group of people that make the change and do the thing. And, it's common in our sector too, in philanthropy and nonprofits and social change. We love to idolize heroes, one person doing an amazing thing. And one person can do amazing things. One person can have an amazing idea. But in fact, it's usually a group of people who are coming together around that good idea to make change together. What was the second part of your question, Nandita?
Well, you did answer it, but why is this a problem? Like, why is this one person can fix it? I think you say, I alone can fix this in the book, right? Like, why is that bad, and how does that relate to this feeling of loneliness and or feeling like we can't affect change?
Yeah, well, it's not only bad, but it's also kind of untruthful. Like and I share this in the book. Like, do you remember when Brett Kavanaugh was being nominated and then had the hearings to become a Supreme Court justice? And he said at one point, I accomplished everything in my life on my own. It was a bootstraps kind of argument. And when you look into it, doesn't take long to know that Brett Kavanaugh went to private school. He grew up in a family that had enough money to send him to private school. He's a third generation Yale graduate. So he might have worked really hard, and I'm sure he did, but he also had a lot of help to get him to where he was able to get. And it made me think about the interviews that I did to build the Donors of Color Network. So I got to interview, I had the great pleasure and good fortune, and it was so much fun to interview 150 wealthy people of color across the country. And one of the guys I interviewed, he said, in a word, bootstraps is bullshit. And he himself was working in finance and was making a very good living. But he talked about his mom and his auntie and a coach and a mentor and all the people who kind of helped him along the way, not to discount the hard work that he put in to get a good education and get good grades and go on to do all the amazing things he's done as a man in his 40s, and earning a lot of money and now giving back a lot of money philanthropically and getting involved in politics and all the things. But he was sure to remember and give credit to all the people around him who helped get him to where he is. And I think that's more truthful. If we think about the things that we've done in our lives. Yeah, like sure, there's individual effort and good ideas as part of it and hard work. But if we really think about how we got to where we get, there's almost always the story of a parent or a grandparent or an auntie, or in one case, an auntie Mame of this other person I interviewed, or a coach or a mentor who helped us get there. And that's a more truthful way of making social change. It's usually not going to be one person who has this idea and does everything. Like they're usually organizing friends, neighbors, colleagues, compadres in the work to get the thing done.
Yeah. So the title of your book is called The Big We. A lot of it explores why philanthropy needs to shift from Big Phil, which you just talked about, to Big We. Explain what you mean by that and what Big We looks like when it comes to giving.
I try to tell stories in my book of lots of different types of big we's, people coming together to be greater than the sum of their individual parts. And the book follows this arc. It's, starting with me and moving to a we and finally talking about a big we. So just like, let's take me, for example, I'm Korean American. I grew up in the Midwest. I was really fortunate. I have been very fortunate to have mom and dad who've always supported me and my brother in what we do, even though they've never understood what it is that my brother and I do. They couldn't tell you to this day probably what it is my brother and I do for to pay our mortgage, to pay our bills. But they've always been really supportive of us. They afforded both of us incredibly good educations, both public elementary schools, and then some private school later, and then getting to go to good colleges. So I've had a lot of, and they've instilled in me a set of values that guide me to this day. So those are the things that come into me, like me personally as Hali Lee, walking in this world and doing the things that I do. My we groups, so moving from a me to a we, are the groups that I'm part of that I can influence and be influenced by. So for me, it might be, my beloved radiant teammates, Latarka Mare and Isis Krauss and Shalini Somayaji. We're building curricula together. We do some advising and strategic planning together for other people. Might be I'm not part of a book group, but I'm part of a Stitch and Bitch. It's a group of friends. We get together regularly, irregularly, to knit, crochet, and bitch and drink and eat together. They get very involved in flipping state legislatures, reproductive rights and issues. I'm part of a block association. My block association in Brooklyn is obsessed with rats and trees. So this is a group of people that cares about the life of a block, a certain block in Brooklyn and the neighboring blocks in our neighborhood, our town. And then the big we has to do with the larger systems in which we live and operate. So that might have to do with the taxation or capital markets or the way we vote, the bigger systems that we have to navigate and swim in order to bring about the change that we want to see. And so the through line that connects the me to the we to the big we are the values that guide me, my most cherished values, and what's my vision for the world. What kind of society do I want to live in and help build, and I want my kids and future generations about whom I can only dream to have and inherit and fix and build and work in. So it's that kind of arc. And I called my book The Big We because I think that this relentless focusing on individuals is literally killing us and our planet. And if we can at least some of the time, and hopefully more of the time, try to shift from a me thinking, me, mine, I, if we can shift from that kind of thinking to a we and an our and an us kind of thinking, then that will not only help us feel more connected to a group and feel belonging, which is the antidote to loneliness. But I think it will also help us think about how we can, what we can do and what we can change in terms of our behavior and practices to help our planet and our communities and our democracy. You asked about belonging and loneliness, and there is a section in my book where I write about that. And I could have written so much about this, and that once you dive into it, it's like really interesting. I found it super interesting. And mayors around the world are realizing the toll, not only to people, but also to economies of loneliness. And it's an epidemic in America and also globally. And Dr. Vivek Murthy wrote that beautiful letter when he was leaving his post as Surgeon General of the United States after the last administration. And then he also wrote this incredibly moving report about loneliness in America. And I think this number is correct. I think he wrote that loneliness is as deadly as smoking 15 cigarettes a day and as deadly as drinking 6 glasses of wine a day. Loneliness, people in America are dying deaths of loneliness and despair. Nicholas Kristof wrote a series in the Times about the people that he used to ride a school bus with in rural Oregon, decades ago. I don't know how old he is, but it's a while ago. And something like a quarter of the kids with whom he rode that school bus have died, deaths of loneliness and despair. And by that, he means and defines it as, addiction or suicide or substance abuse, et cetera, and a mental illness leading to suicide in some cases. It's really tragic. And there's lots of ways to address the epidemic of loneliness. And some of those solutions are internal psychic ones, and some of them are sort of external social ones. Like an internal psychic ones might be, seeing a therapist or starting a meditation practice or joining a faith community, right? Those are internal individualistic things that I can do if I'm feeling lonely. And then the social aspects are things that mayors around the world are trying to think about. And that might be encouraging people to get outside and sit on chatty benches to encourage them to talk to one another across, strangers, encouraging them to talk to one another. People are figuring out ways to put bartering stations within elder community centers to encourage people to go. You and I could go and exchange, I'll trade you my blender for your duster. But by the way, we're also going to be doing that in an elderly community center. So we will be encouraged to speak with the people who are there doing community building there. So there's these things that we can do to kind of nudge people to get together and talk and commune in the ways that we used to. So I try to insert this idea of doing good together, groups of individuals who are doing together, which is collective giving, mutual aid, giving circles, as one way, not the only way, but one good way for regular people who are not billionaires to come together to do good together, whether it is volunteer their time or pool their money and give it away, or go to support an immigrant restaurant together, someone who's new to town and we want to support them. Take an action together with a group of friends as one way to exercise your civic engagement muscles.
Sure. Can you connect the dots a little bit between big philanthropy and loneliness? Like, help me connect those points a little bit. Like, are there ways in which big philanthropy and this focus on the individual has engendered these feelings of loneliness? Obviously, it's a little bigger than that, but like, how are those two related?
Well, this is super concrete, but think about the very rich person who builds a giant house up on a hill, surrounded by a fence, surrounded by a lot of security, who maybe also buys a really big boat so they can go across oceans in a isolated, alone, literally making an island of themselves way. Though that kind of bunker separation mentality is a metaphor for the separateness that I think happens when one has a ton of money and one wields that money in a way to impose one's values and wishes and visions upon the rest of us. Another concrete image to put into our heads, I think, is think about this most recent inauguration of Donald Trump. The people sitting on the dais behind Donald Trump were three men, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, and Jeff Bezos. Those three men together own and control as much wealth as 50% of Americans. So those three men have as much wealth and control as much wealth as 170 million Americans. Now, so keep that in your head. Now, imagine a giving circle. So my giving circle, the Asian Women Giving Circle, we're turning 20 this year. We've been friends for 20 years. We've lived a lot of life together. In 20 years, we've gotten married and divorced and had babies and sent babies to college, helped care for elderly parents, welcomed fur babies and said goodbye to fur babies. And, we've lost jobs and gained jobs. We've just lived a lot of life together. We also eat together, break bread together, drink together. Sometimes we travel together. We go see lots of cultural things together, and we pull our money and give it away together. And because we're a giving circle, the people that we give money to, the organizations we give money to, are actually pretty close to us. Like, some of us have run organizations that have gotten money from the giving circle. So, that thing where you have to kind of recuse yourself if you're on a grant making organization or body. You have to recuse yourself if your connection is a little bit too close to the organization applying for money. Like, someone's always recusing themselves from a conversation about a potential grantee partner because it's run by a sister-in-law, or I used to run it, or I serve on the board of it. So the line between that power dynamic that's kind of inherent in philanthropy between those who are giving the money and those who are receiving the money, there's always a power dynamic and tension there. But I think in the giving circle world, that line is less rigid. It's a little bit more smushed. It's in my book, I write that it's not a Sharpie, it's more like charcoal. It's there, but it's a little bit less defined.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a closeness that can happen when you're a giving circle funding in communities in the community that you live in, that's just not possible. Or maybe it's possible, but it's just not maybe practical, or maybe it's not desirable if you're Big Phil. So I hope that kind of answers your question.
Yeah, it is. And it kind of leads to one of my questions. Why is it a good thing to have the line between funder and grantee be charcoal versus Sharpie? Like, what sort of positives you gain from that, and from that sort of relationship? And again, how does that relate to making people feel like they can affect change in their community, or reducing loneliness, reducing individualism? How does that funder grantee relationship play into all of that?
I guess you're sort of asking, like, why is it better to have a we frame than a me frame?
Yeah.
If I'm distilling that question right,
Yeah.
and I think that having a we, like sitting in a we versus a me, like, I'm just thinking about, like, I feel more efficacy, and like, I went to social work school for grad school, and this feeling of efficacy is a really important one to sort of having good mental health, good mental hygiene, versus this feeling of overwhelm. I can't do anything about this. I cannot affect change. The problems and issues in front of me are just so big. They're overwhelming. That feeling of almost helplessness is not conducive to mental wellness and mental health. So I think we can increase our feelings of being able to do something about it, our feelings of efficacy, if we see ourselves as part of a group affecting that change, rather than I alone I'm gonna try to affect this thing that seems so big, like homelessness in New York City, say. So that's one. I think it's related to sort of mental wellness and efficacy. And the reason a we frame is better than a me frame for belonging is sort of evident. Like if I feel like I'm part of a group, and it can be a group of 5 people, it can be a group of 20 people, it can be a group of 100. If I feel like I'm a part of a group that's doing this thing together, then I feel a sense of belonging with that group, because ideally I've had some conversations about my values and what's important to me and my vision for what I want our community to be with that group. I feel a sense of belonging with that group because we've had that shared conversation. We might have even talked about money, which is like a taboo thing that we're not supposed to talk about in a group, but if you're going to do a giving circle, you kind of have to. So there's been unwritten prohibitions against talking about sex, money, and politics for lots of us in our different families and cultures, but actually those are the most important things to talk about, I think. And if you're part of a giving circle, you will talk about maybe not the sex part, but certainly the money and the values and the politics part. And that's a good thing for building belonging and building connection to other people, which is the antidote to loneliness. Those are also good things to talk about in groups if we care about building civic engagement from the ground up, because it is in these groups that we can talk about rats and trees on my block, which might lead to 1 or 2 of us going to a city council meeting, which is part of being civically engaged, which might mean to some of us, not all of us, going to a hearing or a march or a protest, and it might lead to some of us going, getting more, voting more, and running for office more. There's been, you know this, Nandita, but there's been research out recently by Philanthropy Together and others that have looked at giving circles and giving circle members, and they have found that giving circle members are happier because they are engaged to a group, and they feel a sense of belonging, and they feel a sense of efficacy, and they feel a sense that they're doing something about something that they care about. The research also found that giving circle members do vote more, and we volunteer more, and we give more, and we're more community volunteer people, and some of us run for office. So I think there's more and more and convincing qualitative research out there that shows that giving circles are good for the soul, and good for happiness and belonging and efficacy, and also good for our communities.
Okay, so I have 2 more questions. My first one, and they're related. My first one is for our viewers, if they want to go out and start a giving circle or a mutual aid group or something, where should they start? Like, how do you create this from scratch? Do you, use your block association like you mentioned? And then how do you get to the point where you're sharing these, talking about these hard topics about money, about things like that? How does that happen? Because, it's an organic thing, right? You can't force it, but, what should a viewer do to do all these great things that
I got a lot of ideas there, Nandita. So first thing I think is go to the Philanthropy Together website, because they have a ton of free resources for, like, how do I run a first meeting? What's a fiscal sponsor? What is a giving circle exactly? They also have a directory of giving circles around the world. So if you don't want to start one, you could probably join one that's in your zip code or your area. And then my second piece of advice would be, just do it. There's a theme. There's one metaphor through my book, which is constipation. And in our sector, we can tend to overthink things. We can tend to want to do the perfect thing, find the perfect model, find the perfect group, find the whatever. And that kind of thinking or mindset can tend to kind of gum up the gears. And the wonderful thing, in my opinion, about giving circles and collective giving is that we don't have to recreate Big Phil. We don't have to create a complicated apparatus when we can just really remember that we're a group of friends, neighbors, a book group, mates, whatever, who want to do good together. That's simply what we're trying to do. So if you don't need to have a 501c3 status, then don't do that. If you don't need to even have a bank account, don't do that. Like, lots of giving circles just literally write checks to the same organization, or they might give they might Venmo me and I'll write the check to that organization. There's different ways that you can do it if it feels onerous to set up any of these structures, then don't do it. You can always do it later. And then the third thing I would add is like, don't be perfect, like build in making mistakes and learning and humility, build that into the very, very beginning. Is if you're going to make a list of the group's values and attributes, I would recommend those be included, because we're human and we're going to mess up, and we're going to learn. And that's the important thing, is that we're going to keep trying and keep learning and not be stuck on being perfect.
And so my related question, and this is my last question, but if a big mega donor, a super rich billionaire, if they're listening, they agree with you, and they want to change their giving practices to solve the problems you bring up, to do the types of things that giving circles and mutual aid do well, where should they start? And it's kind of related to something you said earlier about how there's not a real incentive for these folks to change, because this system has been working well for them. But where should they start if they're convinced, they're ready to go?
I think a great thing for that person to do, first, thank you for thinking about it, is a cool thing to do would be to match the giving circles that are already doing the work. I mean, a lot of big donors, whether they're billionaires or not, have cared recently about getting more proximate, funding more grassroots, funding smaller organizations that they just don't know about. Like I don't know about the great work being done in rural Alabama around access to abortion. I just don't know, because I don't live there. But what I can do is match the giving circles who are in Alabama. And there's, like, for example, there's a great network of giving circles called Community Investment Network, CIN. And they're mostly Black giving circles operating mostly in the US South. So one cool thing that someone with more money, a lot of money, could do is to just match all the giving circles in the CIN network. The Latino Community Foundation has giving circle network up and down the state of California, and now going into Arizona and Nevada, I think, as well. They could all be matched, and it's a really great way of getting money to grassroots that in a way that you probably can't do on your own, just because only one person can only know so much. So I would suggest doing that. There have been some really cool collaborative funds that have popped up where people with big foundations and some big donors are pulling their money to fund climate or fund housing, different issue areas. That could be a cool way to plug in also, if this person was interested in doing collective giving. And also, I would say, like, even if you're a billionaire, like, you can form a giving circle with your friends. Why not? But maybe that giving circle will be giving away more dollars. I would say you're human, and I would bet money that you'll find joy and connection and relationship building and community by doing giving along with your friends. Even if you're adding some more zeros to the end of the donation amount, like, I'd say go for it. And I bet it's a way that you can augment your giving and also have some more fun and build community while doing so. I also want to say, just like, as an aside, not related but not related, Nandita, that I applaud Bill Gates for his announcement last week that he's going to give away 99% of his fortune by December 31st, 2045, in 20 years. And he's going to the foundation's doors will close on December 31st, 2045, which will probably be in his lifetime. He's turning 70 this year, so he'll be 90. And I really applaud that. He's speeding up the pledge that he and Melinda made when they were married to give away their fortune. But I think they were going to do it within a couple of decades after their death. And now he's just saying the world's needs are so urgent that he's challenging his team and staff to give it away beforehand. So I applaud that. And I hope that I'm sure he's using his energy right now to influence, persuade, organize his peers to do the same. And I think that's really cool behavior. Can I add something else that
Please.
I don't know if it can fit in somewhere else, but one of the metaphors through my book is this metaphor of a kitchen table. And kitchen tables have been the locus of a lot of powerful organizing in this country always, especially for women, people of color, and queer folks. And billionaires have kitchen tables too. So in what I just said, use your kitchen table to organize your peers. And all of us who have a kitchen table or who have a small living room that seats a few people can use it as the locus of making change. to that metaphor, I add an important piece, which is add a seat or two or add a leaf or two to invite people to your table who are slightly outside your group of regulars. And it's important to do that because if we just stick to the regulars, the people I always call to do whatever, then that tends to reify things like tribalism and echo chambers. And in this moment, sociopolitically in the United States, I think all of us need to practice reaching out a little bit to include and talk with and relate to and find belonging with people who are a little bit different from ourselves. So to the metaphor of a kitchen table, which I think is useful to remember because it's something most of us have or have access to, but remember to add a leaf or two to it. I have a great story about a kitchen table if we have time to share it.
Yes, please.
Should I just share it and then you can decide if you want to
Yes,
save
please.
it or not? So my mother-in-law is 96 years old and she lives in rural Connecticut. And a few years ago, at the ripe young age of, 92 or 93, she became interested in trying to help flip a Connecticut state legislative seat from the incumbent, who was a Republican man who was kind of part of an old boys network kind of deal, to a younger candidate who is a woman who is also a Democrat. So she reached out to the candidate, whose name is Maria, and the campaign manager, how can I help? As one slightly older lady, how can I help do this thing? So they hatched this plan that Aka, we call her Aka, my mother-in-law, they hatched a plan that Aka, who has lived in her town since the 70s, she could host a weekly tea party around her kitchen table. Her kitchen table seats 8. So if there's a spot for Aka and a spot for the candidate, that left 6 seats around her table. So for 12 weeks over the course of that summer, she hosted a tea party so that people could come meet this new candidate. So Aka figures that over that summer, she hosted about 75 people from her town and neighboring towns. People, she didn't know all of them, but people were inviting their friends, etc. The election happened in November, and it was so close that it went to a recount. And at the end of the recount, the candidate, the challenger, Maria, won the election by 64 votes.
Wow.
And in the debriefs, after the election, the candidate and the campaign manager, they told Aka, and they told me at dinner a couple months ago, actually, that they think that Aka's tea parties made a material difference in flipping that legislative seat. And that she was instrumental in helping Maria flip that seat from red to blue. And I love that story, firstly, because I love Aka, and she's wonderful, and she turns 96. She turned 96 in March. But I also love it because it shows what can happen and she's an individual with a great idea, but she brought a lot of other people to the table with her in order to make change in her community.
Yeah. That's a great note to end on. That's all we have time for, but thank you, Holly, for talking this through with me. I loved reading your book, and it's been really a pleasure chatting with you. Thank you, everyone, for joining the conversation. We hope you tune into future episodes of the Commons in Conversation, and in the meantime, visit the Commons at philanthropy.com/thecommons. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, Nandita.
Thanks.